Hi, welcome to History of Education Week 6, I think. I just wanted to say that I'm feeling incredibly honored to have read your midterm timelines. They're amazing. I'm also really excited about your final exam ideas. And I know that this is a tough term for most of us, but I could not think of a better group of people to spend this time with. And I just wanted to say I'm really grateful for you and thankful for all of the work you're doing. Um, and now we're going to talk about the progressive era. So the guiding questions for this week are essentially, what is progressive education? What were progressive reforms? And to what degree did progressive educational reform reveal broader trends in American society? And the texts that I've asked you to read are the chapter from Urban and Wagner on progressive education, as well as two primary source documents from the time period. So the Committee on Secondary School Studies, Committee of 10 report from 1893, and then the Commission on the Reorganization of Secondary Education, Cardinal Principles of Secondary Education report from 1918. And then a third thing that I wanted you to look at was the Common Core curriculum, which was adopted in 2008 and then has been adopted since by most of the states in the United States. And I want to use these three because this week, what we will be focusing on is curriculum. We'll be focusing on how all of these social problems come together and how social problems and their solutions take form in schools. But the thing that I'm really interested in you doing by the end of this week with your small group is to create a master curriculum. So to create a curriculum from all of these different curriculum documents about what you think people should learn in school. Because what's interesting about this time period, the progressive era, is that they were dealing with a lot of the questions that we still deal with when we're thinking about how to best make public schools a place where the majority of people, where all the people in theory can come together and can learn the things that we believe that they need to learn to be productive and caring members of our society. So historian William Rees tells us that part of the change that occurred with regard to progressive era reform, say that changed between the Common School movement or the Reconstruction era in schooling, had to do with how theorists began to rethink the child, the curriculum, and the purposes of schooling. And I think of those as sort of three kind of focuses that we can take on this. So, how are people rethinking what children are and how they should be in society? What are the conflicts over what we believe people should and shouldn't learn in school? And then, what do we want school to do? And we're asking school to do different things at this moment than we were asking it to do in New England in the 1700s. So, attending to these three pieces is going to help us really think through, what does it mean when we say progressive education? So the era that we're talking about, just to, historical eras are sort of made up, but roughly when people talk about the progressive era in the United States, they're talking about around 1890 to 1920. And I wanted to put these two pictures up because I think that they demonstrate some of the crises of this moment. So on the left, you have the Breakers Mansion, which was built by the Vanderbilt family in the 1890s in Newport, Rhode Island. So looking out of those windows, you would be looking at the Atlantic Ocean and your neighbors next to you. And on the other side also had these amazingly large mansions that were not even their primary home. These were cottages. These were where they went to on the weekends from New York City. So you have that happening in 1890. And then on the right, you have Lewis Hine was a photographer who documented child laborers in the progressive era. And he took this picture of, this is the quote from the caption, Little Spinner in Globe Cotton Mill, Augusta, Georgia. Overseer said she was regularly employed. So you have the extreme wealth of the Vanderbilt family, for example. And then on the other hand, you have extreme poverty. And when we look at this image of a child working, it contradicts what we believe children should be doing. So you have also this transition in terms of what are children, what is childhood, what are children, for? What are they good for? I'm joking, but seriously. And the context of the progressive era reforms that we're talking about, so in addition to that extreme inequality, we're also talking about a real increase in enrollment. So more people are going to school, and that's in large part a result of the numbers are just increasing. The Common School movement had been successful in sort of apprenticing people into school. this is the time period in which states are putting in compulsory educational laws, so kids are supposed to go to school. And this is also a time period in which people are rejecting the idea of child labor. And so if children are not laboring on fields or not laboring in factories, they need to go somewhere and they need to go to school. So this sort of shows you that there's just a substantial enrollment increase in this time period. So if I were to think through the three problems, I mean, there are many problems, but just to kind of lump it together of the progressive era or the Gilded Age, which predates kind of the progressive era, three things that come to mind that reformers and people interested in making public schools different, better, were thinking through. The problems were dealing with social inequality, participatory democracy and the crisis of, what does a vote mean? Who gets the right to vote? What does it mean to participate? And then the fallout of industrial capitalism. So factories, workers, extreme inequality, and exploitation. So for the first question, it's kind of like, well, how do we deal with inequality? There's no weekend. There's not a modern labor movement. There are trusts and monopolies. So people are able to hold control over one industry and sort of artificially control the price. There are not regulations in place to protect workers. And then at the same time, there's massive immigration from Europe and sort of the beginnings of slum-like conditions in cities as a result of poverty and overcrowding and really poor planning policy. And in terms of democracy during this moment, there's really a tension between how do we have common people participate, but also how do rich people and people in positions of power maintain power. There's a lot of corruption. That's not like a new thing, and it certainly didn't end in the progressive era, right? But political bosses give jobs to their friends, and there's a lack of transparency about how people come to have a job working for the federal government, or not the federal government, the municipal government, right? And then there's a lot about inclusion and exclusion. So in terms of participatory democracy, women and people of color are left out. This is when women are campaigning for the right to vote under the 14th Amendment, which, as I told you last week, ensures equal protection under the law. This is where the South is still trying to figure out ways around the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. So they're imposing poll taxes. They're making reading a requirement for voting, as you saw in the grandfather clause from Louisiana. They write segregation into their constitutions, and then the Supreme Court upholds these practices in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. And then in terms of capitalism, this economic problem, there's extreme inequality and abuses in industry. It's starting to make people think about the problem with having an unregulated economy. So people are trying to figure out, how do we make capitalism livable, or can we? So there are progressives who are trying to make capitalism more sustainable by regulating labor practices. And then there are people who just want to burn things down, right? There are people who are like, I reject capitalism. Capitalism is an unsustainable way of organizing the economy. So those two tensions at the same time are happening. So progressives are trying to reform or fix these social problems. And essentially, if we're talking about progressivism as in a movement from this moment in history, 1890 to 1920, it's a movement based on the idea that innovation and transparent and honest government can bring about social justice and or order. And justice and order might not be the same things, right? So order is very different from justice. But this is what people are thinking about. But what's interesting about it is that progressivism is not actually partisan. So there are people on the left and the right, or the conservative and liberal side, or liberal and conservative sides of the political spectrum, who take up progressive ideas. So there are different ways of approaching it, and we could talk a lot about it, but we are very interested today in how it takes form in schools. So what are the effects of this kind of thinking about the world on how schools looked? So some general progressive beliefs are that there should be a move away from laissez-faire policies. So laissez-faire is sort of like, oh, well, we'll just let things go. Things will just work out right in the end. And people were like, nah, we need some government regulating industry. We need government regulating what food we eat. We need government regulating. Otherwise, without regulation, people get hurt. So this is the first moment that people are looking toward the government for that kind of regulation. There are attempts to make the U.S. more responsive to the people, for voting purposes. Um, there are there are attempts to limit the power of political bosses. So, trying to make hiring and firing more transparent, trying to get rid of people who would get elected to a position and then stay there and sort of deal dirty with people. There was also the desire to improve workers' rights, to create better conditions for the poor and immigrants, and by extension, to clean up the cities, whatever that entailed. And then there were also progressives who believed in ending racial segregation and Jim Crow policies in the South. So progressivism in schools looked a little different. I mean, it took some of those pieces and it kind of borrowed from a lot of that. But essentially, what progressivism came to look like in school was that it changed the curriculum, it changed the control over education and the control over schooling. It brought in an era of scientific management of school leadership. It brought in a time, or sort of in taking all of the stuff that had happened during the Common School movement, it reorganized that and kept the infrastructure of schools, but created districts and centralized power and sort of rationalized that. And then, in large part as a result of the increased enrollments, the curriculum became differentiated. So it looked much more similar to what we know now than what was happening during the earlier time periods, like the Common School movement. Because if everyone's going to high school, you have to preserve advantage for some people to get buy-in, and you have to make sure that people are, I don't really agree with this idea, but you have to make sure that people are tracked into different kinds of curricula that allow them to take up then their life's work after graduation, right? So it's a shift from school is good because it imbues people with moral virtue, it makes good citizens, to school is good because it helps people get the job that they need to get. And that's very similar to kind of what we are thinking about now in terms of schooling. And if you want to look through sort of these effects, you can look at my version of Urban and Wagner, page 179, has kind of a list and some explanations. So another kind of differentiation that happens when people are talking about the effect of progressivism in schools is that there are two sort of camps. And this is David Tyack, who is a historian of education, put forward this idea of there are pedagogical progressives and then there are administrative progressives. So just like I said, how people were able to be considered progressive thinkers, even though they were on different sides of the political spectrum, in school, the way that this looked was that there were people who argued for some sort of reforms, and then there are people who argued for other kinds of reforms. So I'm first going to talk about this idea of a pedagogical progressive. So pedagogical progressives, came out of this idea of like, as our concept of childhood changes, so as we decide that child labor is unacceptable, children are kind of put into this weird developmental category, and people start to study the best ways to learn and teach. So this is kind of the advent of ed psychology. People start to rethink then how best to educate. Maybe we shouldn't lecture at children or make them memorize things or hit them, right? This is a different kind of way of thinking. And the pedagogical progressives advocated a child-centered teaching, experiential learning, and the development of practical skills. So really, people who were in schools and trying to formulate school policy, who were coming at it from a pedagogically progressive standpoint, were interested in reshaping the curriculum to have school be a place that responds to social problems and school be a space in which the material of school is a reflection of social reality. So this is John Dewey is sort of the guy who comes to mind. And then if we kind of think through it to its logical point where we're talking about the legacy of pedagogical progressivism in school now, we would think about project-based learning. We might think of culturally relevant teaching. So really just trying to make school be more child-centered. Then the other camp of people who were also progressive but approaching it from a different way were considered by David Tyack, again, historian of education, to be administrative progressives. And administrative progressives were interested in borrowing ideas from industry. So this is when we have bells and rows and class periods and schools looking more and more like factories. So there's this almost obsession with efficiency, right? And with expertise and with kind of organizing schools and making them into coherent systems. So this is like where you first start having a district office and administration and a superintendent and systems of credentialing people. And again, none of this is evil, right? It's not a bad idea to organize schools into coherent systems. It's not a bad idea to have bells or rows. If you have more people in school, it makes sense that you might want to try to make things more efficient spatially. But yeah, these two ideas were sort of at odds in some ways with one another. And I guess as the argument goes, David Tyack and other historians of education would argue that administrative progressives won out. So people were more inclined to want to borrow ideas from industry and organize schools to make them into coherent systems than to take, say, a more child-centered approach to the curriculum. And that the enduring effect of the progressive era is really that it restructured the form of schooling and made it into what we now understand schooling to be. Okay, so we have these three documents that I asked you to read for today. We have the Committee of 10, we have the Cardinal Principles, and then I asked you to read the Common Core, right, for Wednesday, not for today. And we've all probably heard of the Common Core, but even before it was instituted, there were various attempts to create standardization. And I guess one of the things I might ask is why? Why are we so obsessed with making schools standardized? And what are the benefits of that? And maybe what are the drawbacks? So in 1892, a committee of 10 men, white men, was formed by the National Educational Association, the NEA, which is now a teachers union. There were lots of higher ed folks, so they were slightly disconnected from the everyday life of schools. So they were very much unlike the labor force in the school population. So the school population was white, but it was also not white, and the majority of people who worked in schools at least the primary level were women. So that's sort of a thing to think about. And the report is an answer to questions about what is important for people to know. And I'm interested in putting these questions up here because I think that they're really similar to questions we might have today. So, for example, there's questions about at what age should different fields of study be introduced? How many hours a week should people devote time to it? How many years should people take it? So, like how many years should you have to take English language arts, right? That's a question we still sort of think about. What is a reasonable amount of content to cover in a year? What kind of form should these things take? This number 7 is really interesting. Should the subject be treated differently for people who are going to college, for those who are going to a scientific school, and for those who presumably are going to neither? So really people are thinking about, or this group of men is thinking about at this moment, can you teach everyone everything? How do you do it? Who gets what? And what's the benefit? And what do we want the purpose of schooling to be? What do we want people to get out of it? And what they came up with after asking all of these questions, and you can sort of also make your own arguments because you've read the document or you've read part of the document, they recommended a humanistic curriculum or kind of a liberal arts curriculum. And they argue that power comes through knowledge. We can't conceive of observation and memory in the abstract. So this sort of obsession with the classics, so Latin, Greek, language, mathematics, and the sciences. And this is what they say will make an educated person. And this is 1892. Okay. Then in 1918, another report came out. And this was the second report that you read. So this was created by the Commission on the Reorganization of Secondary Education and the NEA in 1918. So it builds on the Committee of 10 reports. So it's operating in reference to it. It's in conversation with it, right? And it comes up with some objectives. for students to learn, right? So there's health, command of fundamental processes, worthy home membership, vocation, like trade or job, citizenship, worthy use of leisure, and ethical character. So these again are kind of like these cardinal principles, like these guiding principles of what people should know. And it's very different from, the first set of ideas, which is liberal artsy, Latin, Greek, English. This is a little more based in an idea of trying to create dispositionally suitable people to participate in democracy, right? So I want to think a little bit about, like, are these still things we want people to be able to do? I mean, we might frame it a little differently. We don't use command of fundamental processes or vocation or worthy home membership, but what is present here and in 1893 or 1892 that we no longer care about, right? What is absent? What did the writers of the document believe about democracy in both cases? And then I think a general thing to ask ourselves is, what do we want people to get out of school? They're there for 12 years. Is it more important to know content or to have values and skills? And at the core of all of this is the idea and the conflict and the, debate over what makes an educated person. Like what kind of people do we want to graduate from the schools that we pay for with our money and our investment, right? So what you're going to do in groups is your group has been given the responsibility of choosing a curriculum for the American high school. So lots of people have tried to do this. What I want you to do is use the Committee of 10, the Cardinal Principles of Secondary Education, and the Common Core Curriculum to create the ultimate curriculum. I want you to write out a list of, I think I said 8 to 10 items. Yeah, 8 to 10 skills, content areas, dispositions, and include which document you got them from. And so a thing to do before you maybe embark on writing a list of mix and match stuff is to think about the key components of each curriculum, the assumptions that are made about the nature of children and of learning, and the purpose of education that each document reflects. And so that will be due on next Sunday, and it's under facilitated dialogue, in the on Google Classroom. It's in a document that's all set up for you to work through. Have a great week, and I look forward to reading your work, and I will see you later.